Let's take a look at the market called a monopoly. Most people are familiar with monopolies. In essence, a monopoly is anytime one company is essentially the same as the industry. So when there's one provider and that provider is the only provider, we would say they are the industry. In reality, monopolies can have multiple providers, but if you're a firm operating at 90% market share, you're essentially a monopoly. And as an example, if you look at Microsoft Office, so Microsoft Office, yes, there's other providers out there, but there's really only one product that people are going to pay for, and that's Microsoft Office. They've pretty much always been a monopoly, and they still are to this day a monopoly. If you're working on really intense Excel spreadsheets, most people don't want to work in Google Docs or other products. They're going to use Microsoft Excel to do that. So Microsoft Office is a good example of a monopoly because they've got 90% or better market share in the Office suite business. It's not the only example of monopoly, but in today's world, it's a good one. Your local utilities would be another one. There's only one electric company. There's one water company. It wouldn't make sense for someone else to have a competing electric company unless we had wireless electricity, which may come in the future. But for now, where you're depending on wires to get electricity from point A to point B, it only makes sense to have one electric company. So your local utilities are examples of monopolies on a local basis or local or regional basis. So here's when we look at this, when we compare the different characteristics of a monopoly here, we'll start with the demand curve. So the demand curve in this industry is a little bit different than in perfect competition. When you look at perfect competition, you've got perfect elasticity. Everybody's charging the same price. This is not true in a monopoly. We're the only provider. So in the early days of a monopoly where the quantity is less, we might be charging a relatively high price. And when you think about new products that come out that have markets like monopolies, usually in the first few years, people pay a little bit more for that type of product. And then as more is produced or other competitors find their way to get in, that may put some competitiveness on the price, causing it to come down a little bit over a period of time. But monopolies will get to a point of maximum efficiency here, where they're going to operate at a certain quantity, and that quantity is typically at the maximized point of average total cost being at the lowest point possible. We have as much efficiency in this business as possible. We call it economies of scale. Economies of scale are we have a reduction in price up to a certain point, which gives us total efficiency. And to produce any more than that means we've got to increase costs again. And so usually businesses don't want to do that. And so we reach this point of efficiency, and that is where average total costs would be at their lowest point. Now, in a monopoly, this may not always be true, because if you take a phone company in 1890 and 1900 and 1910, they would incur additional total costs to build out new neighborhoods. But even then, when you had one telephone company, which was AT&T, when it was still a monopoly, it would avoid certain areas. It would say it's not worth going into rural areas because there's not enough additional customers to make it worth building that out. And they would depend on other telephone companies to do that in rural areas. So this average total cost is something that even monopolies will be looking at. We want to reach a point of maximum efficiency. Now, we also have this marginal revenue curve here. And this marginal revenue curve is a little bit different than the demand curve. So when we looked at perfect competition, marginal revenue, each additional unit of revenue was the same as the cost to sell one more product. That's not true here in a monopoly. What we see with marginal revenue is typically revenue is going to be below where our price is. So our price here is what the demand is. And we make less money than we charge in price because we've got to build this thing out. And in theory, you can actually have a negative number for your marginal revenue. And so that makes this model a little bit different. The characteristics for a monopoly are the opposite of perfect competition. But just as perfect competition is a theoretical model, so too is a monopoly, because most monopolies have some level of competition, except those local utilities. But are there competitors to Microsoft Office? Heck yes. you've got Google Suites, you've got other platforms that have been around for a long time trying to compete with Microsoft Office. So in this case, we'd say, theoretically speaking, there's one firm. One firm certainly dominates the market. There's really no close substitute to what that firm brings to the table. There's barriers to entry, real strong barriers. It's not easy to start a utility, as an example, and nobody's got extra cable and telephone poles and places where they can dig to add water lines. Like, just don't have those things laying around. It's not easy to get into those types of business. Usually there's some specialized knowledge, and so you got to know a little bit. You got to have some interesting knowledge to get into this type of market. And then finally, the firm is the price maker, so they're going to set the price. When we look at perfect competition, everybody's a price taker. We'll take whatever the price is in the market, but in a monopoly, that firm sets the price. Now, it doesn't mean you can charge anything, but when you look at new types of products and when there are early entrants charging, usually you'll see some really high prices for products that are out there. And that's because they've got to pay. They've got to pay for creating that new type of a product. Usually it's tied to the barriers to entry and even maybe the specialized knowledge. So the firm is a price maker. So this is the market of a monopoly.